that was really the basis of this triangular relationship, although it was actually two bilateral relationships. But from the U.S. point of view, that was the fundamental foundation of our friendship with those two countries that became our best allies in the Middle East. Now the Cold War is over. Israel and Saudi Arabia are not necessary for this project anymore. It's time for us to rethink our approach to that part of the world. Now, you can't be picking up and dumping allies all the time. That's not good for any country. Nonetheless, it's equally bad for you to remain frozen in relationships that may have made sense in an earlier era without coming to grips with the fact that that era is over now. The great German strategist Clausewitz had a line that I love. He said, "Generals are always fighting the last war." This is a great insight because the last war, of course, is the war that generals know everything about. They know how to win that war. That's our problem in Afghanistan. Everybody that's running our policy there is a 20th century man. They know how to win wars in the 20th century. When I hear these phrases like, we need to clear territory and hold it, I want to pull my hair out. That's a great way to win World War II, but this is not the way to win a war in Afghanistan. Clearing territory and holding it is an old idea. That's how to win the last war. Now, we've figured out how to win the Cold War. And we're still trying to proceed with the same policies that helped us win the Cold War. But we're not in that war anymore. Now we got to think about what's the future. So I ask myself, who could be our partners? I still believe that the United States is not able to approach any region of the world, and particularly this hugely complex region of the Middle East, by itself. We need partners. We need partners who know that part of the world. Who could they be? So we know what the past was. What would the future be? What would be in America's interest? Well, when you look for allies, I think you need to look for two qualities. You want to ally your country with countries that share your country's long-term strategic goals. What you want to achieve in the world over the long run is what they also want to achieve. That's the first qualification for an ally. The second one is one that we don't often take into sufficient consideration. A good ally is a country whose society shares the values of your society. This makes, for example, Saudi Arabia a less than ideal ally. Everything I like to do is essentially punishable by either flogging or execution in Saudi Arabia. When you see the social structure of Saudi life, you realize that this country has nothing in common with our country. So there are no elections. It's ruled by a hereditary monarchy. The United States has effectively guaranteed the right of male heirs of King Ibn Saud to rule as they see fit indefinitely. We have not made this commitment to any other country in the world. And on the other side, Saudi Arabia's long-term strategic interests are probably not the same as ours. What's good for Saudi Arabia over the long run might not be good for us. With Israel, I think the situation is a little different. I do think that we have, not just for moral reasons, but for real political and strategic reasons, a basis for a long-term partnership with Israel. Nonetheless, Israel's long-term security and its long-term survival is only going to be guaranteed if there's a stable neighborhood. If the Middle East continues as it is, Israel's future is uncertain. The only long-term security for Israel is a peaceful Middle East. Because of the peculiarities of Israeli domestic politics, Israel finds it very difficult to pursue policies that are going to produce that long-term goal. It's trapped in the conflict paradigm. For example, no Israeli prime minister ever will be able to give up the settlements in the West Bank unless forced to do so. Unless there's an outside force requiring it, there's just not a political constituency there ever for anyone to do that. Yet that a removal of settlements is an absolute prerequisite for peace. So somehow we have to find a way to support Israel in a deeper and richer way. And the greatest contribution we can make over the long run to Israel is to try to pacify the Middle East. How can we do that? Well, as I said, I think the first thing we ought to ask ourselves is, who would be good partners for us? Now, this requires us, above all, before we can even think about who'd be a good partner, to resolve that we want partners. It's a difficult jump for the United States, because a partner is someone that you listen to, someone that you pay attention to, someone whose advice you follow. We're not used to that in the United States. We like other kind of partners, the kind of partners that do what we say. We're used to that because we've had many of them all during the Cold War. If we really want a partnership that will secure our long-term interests in the Middle East, then we have to listen to our partners. We have to be guided by our partners. Otherwise, there's no point in trying to find partners. Now, if we can get past that hurdle, which is not a low one for Americans in our psychological approach to the world, then we ask ourselves, okay, who could they be? Well, you look for countries that have these two qualifications. Number one, their long-term strategic interests are the same as ours, or nearly the same, and their societies share the same values as our societies. Well, when you go down the list of Middle East countries, you can discard a lot of them very quickly on those, just with those two standards. And actually, in the end, when you go through the entire Muslim Middle East, you only find two countries that share our long-term strategic goals and whose societies share the values of our societies. Essentially, our societies are democratic and open and believe in the Enlightenment values of the individual. Well, those two countries are Turkey and Iran. Turkey and Iran are the only two countries in the Muslim Middle East that have long democratic traditions. And let me just talk briefly about their history, since I'm not so sure how fully aware Americans are of these very interesting facts. During the first decade of the 20th century, there were profound revolutions in both Turkey and Iran. Constitutions were proclaimed. Elections were held. During the 1920s and 30s, both Turkey and Iran were ruled by zealous reformist dictators who violently ripped their country up from their roots in the Middle East sands and tried to reorient those countries towards Western values. They called them the values of universal civilization, but everyone knew they really meant European. And those were, of course, Ataturk in Turkey and Reza Shah, the father of the Shah who was overthrown in 1979, in Iran. During the 20s and 30s, these countries were dramatically modernized. Universities were built, and the infrastructure was built, education was built, women's rights were institutionalized. These countries made huge leaps toward modernity during that period. Then, at the end of World War II, the ideas of anti-colonialism and nationalism were coursing through the developing world, including in the Middle East. And those ideas had great echo in Turkey and Iran. In both countries, they led to the emergence of a really democratic system. Turkey held its first multi-party election in 1950. Up to that time, Turkey had been a one-party state since its founding in 1923. So what happened in Turkey in 1950 was something really remarkable. It hasn't happened in very many countries in the whole world. That is that the leader of a one-party state voluntarily transformed it into a multi-party state. He held an election. He insisted that the votes be counted honestly. And then when he lost, he left office voluntarily. This was quite a radical step. And over the decades since then, Turkish democracy, despite some zigzags and some setbacks, has consolidated itself not just institutionally, but also in the minds of ordinary Turks. The same thing happened in Iran in the early 1950s. A democratic system was consolidated. The elections, which had been held regularly all the way since the first decade of the 20th century, became honest. They became real elections.